what we're going to do is I'm going to first introduce the names of everybody on this particular panel. I'm not even sure which order I'm going in, but Magdalena is sitting there on my far right. This is not a political statement. Miss Dr. El Sawabi, did I pronounce it right?
Sit down, close enough.
Close enough for government work. She is the second person on the panel, and she teaches at Elon University. I went back and checked, and it's in Greensboro, North Carolina.
It is.
So I am now more knowledgeable than you ever heard. Sitting on my immediate left is Jennifer Oliver from Seton Hall, which is across the river by the train, and Patricia Zettler, who knew me, or at least of me, when I was at Stanford, now at Ohio State. And so what we do is we have a powerhouse panel, and this is the way in which we're going to proceed, hoping that it meets with the approval of everybody in the audience, or whether it does. What I'm going to ask everybody to do, since the title of this thing is Regulation and Reform, is to ask you each for 2 or 3 minutes, starting one and going to the other, to give me what regulation you wish to put into place and what reform you hope it will sort of implement. And then after that, we will mix it up amongst ourselves in the most collegial style. And when that is done, we will take questions from the audience, and whether they're friendly or hostile, we will respond in kind. So, so thank you. Anyhow, let's start, Magdalena. Take that mic in front of you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. So I can speak from the public health perspective. I'm trained as an epidemiologist. So instead of talking about regulations of the prescription opioid supply, what I would like to put forth is policies that affect access to treatment for opioid use disorder. So we know that overdoses from opioids are increasing every day, and we think that one of the most effective approaches that states can take to address this problem is increasing access to treatment for opioid use disorder, increasing access to evidence-based treatment, particularly through access of medications like buprenorphine and methadone. I think one of the most effective ways to do that is by expanding Medicaid coverage across states. We know that since 2014, after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, I think about 20 states expanded Medicaid coverage. From looking at the data, we also know that those states that expanded Medicaid coverage also saw a substantial increase in access to treatment for opioid use disorder, and in conjunction, a subsequent decrease in opioid-related overdose deaths. So it seems to me that policies that are aimed at increasing access to treatment, and in particular, I think in this case, Medicaid expansion, show great promise in addressing this problem on a long-term basis, and particularly because if we think about the problem as it is right now, the profile of the problem has really shifted so that now most of the deaths are due to illegally manufactured synthetics rather than prescription opioids. So we really need to be targeting people who are experiencing problems from the whole range of opioids beyond just prescription opioids.
Saying that she would not offer a regulation or a proposal, she promptly offered a regulation and a proposal. Thank you so much. Okay, we're now going to turn to Talib. Take a shot.
All right, so my background is a little odd in the sense that I have a PhD in public health and health services management and policy, but my focus was in health policy and politics. And I also have a JD in this, right? So most of my work approaches the problem that is the opioid crisis from a systems perspective. And in doing so, I argue that we really need to make sure we not only frame this as a health problem, but also as a demand problem. And what I mean by that is we really need to drill down and try to understand in a patient-centered way from the people who are affected why it is that they demand the drug. So why do people use? And that really is the only way I argue that we're going to be able to address the problem. So why do people use? Well, there is actually research where people go out there and they, oh my God, yes, they do this. They interview people who have overdosed, and they look at commonalities across the people who have overdosed. And what they found across the different studies are high rates of untreated pain, high rates of untreated depression, as well as just as you may have you may have heard of the diseases of despair, or this whole idea of lack of hope. I myself have read through many testimonies in front of Congress in which one of the common threads is that you hear people who are testifying that have overdosed say, I was just waiting to die. And that makes you kind of stop to think, because had that person not been using drugs, and had they have sent that to a clinician, we would have said this person is really depressed. They're just waiting to die, right? So why do people just want to die? What is it about their reality that's so bad that all they want to do is escape? And so if you look at other models of drug policy in developed countries, they tend to not only look at things like increasing access to treatment, but increasing access to opportunity, to job training, to housing, having a social safety net. I know, how dare I, but actually having a social safety net that guarantees a base minimum of livelihood as these persons work to improve their, to treat their addiction and to improve their lives, that I believe is the key to addressing the opioid crisis.
So no small problems does not deserve a cosmic solution, right? Well, I'm in favor of the cosmos as well as everybody else. Ms. Oliva?
I agree with both of those suggestions. They're excellent ones, so thank you. My big concern here is on the supply side as well. What we did was you heard the panel earlier today. Pain was grossly undertreated. We have this pendulum swing every so many decades in the United States, and then as soon as we finally figured out there's a problem, we swung back the other way. Looked at law enforcement, looked at DEA, and enacted wide, broad crackdowns in the form of surveilling individuals who were struggling with dependency and use disorder through PBMPs and other surveillance tools, and criminalizing the behavior again. So while you hear in the newspapers, then the narrative from politicians is that this is a public health issue, this is a disease, we treat this differently than we do any other public health issue or disease. So my proposal would be reforms of the Controlled Substance Act to address the DEA's behavior here, eliminate the DEA from surveilling folks at the use level, patients, and reforming DEA rules that make it, to this day, much, much more difficult to access Medicaid-assisted treatment and other evidence-based treatment techniques than it is to still get an extended-release OxyContin.
Well, I commend you for your brevity and your wit. Okay, Ms. Zettler?
So I, in my prior life before entering academics, I was an attorney at the FDA, and I also should disclose a potential financial conflict of interest. I'm retained by certain plaintiffs in 2 pharmaceutical antitrust cases as an expert, one against the manufacturer of Suboxone, a buprenorphine naloxone combinations, that's a drug for opioid use disorder, and one against the manufacturer of Opana, an opioid, and a manufacturer of a generic version of Opana. Those are our antitrust cases, not the cases we were talking about this morning, nevertheless. Just want to disclose that. As a former FDA attorney and now someone who studies the agency and thinks about public health law, I completely agree with what others have said, that the demand side of the equation is important. If we think about the supply side, I think expecting the FDA to, so typically when FDA evaluates the safety and effectiveness of drugs, so we all know that's one of FDA's jobs, it's typically conceived as taking a narrow view and evaluating the safety and effectiveness of a drug for its intended use when it's used in the intended dose by the intended person, within the sort of confines of a physician-patient relationship or healthcare provider-patient relationship. And there are good reasons for that. The risks and benefits of drugs differ depending on their uses. We might think the risk of severe birth defects is acceptable for a drug intended for leprosy or cancer, but not for a drug intended for morning sickness in pregnant women, right? So safety is a relative term. I think that FDA could take a broader perspective with drugs like opioids and other drugs that have consequences and are known to be used in ways that deviate from that intended use. And by taking a broader perspective on what kind of evidence is relevant to the agency's safety and effectiveness determination, that can help us both achieve sort of what we classically conceive of as FDA's role, protecting consumers from unsafe and ineffective products, but also would help us produce more information about these products and learn more about what's actually happening, what might be other ways to treat pain, and so on. So that's my
Okay.
that's my spiel.
Well, let me start with my first question, which I'm going to address to the panel generally, which picks up on a remark that Magdalena made, which I don't think had been absorbed or responded to explicitly by the others. I got to get some drama into this. What you said was that the nature of the opioid crisis has changed in that originally it was prescription drugs that were misused in some way, but now it's the manufactured synthetic by essentially parties who have no kind of legal accountability. And so the question I want to ask everybody on the panel is, well, when you do this changed the attitude that we should have against tort enforcement against the reputable pharmaceutical companies, one, and two, what should it do with respect to the way in which we deal with trying to criminalize or otherwise sanction and punish the unauthorized manufacturers? Do we know anything about their distribution, concentration, or size? Since you started this show, Magdalena, perhaps you could be the first person to try and answer these puzzlers.
Sure. That's actually a really good question, and we've actually done some research recently where we've looked at the role of the pharmaceutical industry marketing on prescribing practices and overdose deaths. And while it's true that a great majority of the deaths right now are from illegally manufactured synthetics like fentanyl, still prescription opioids are one of the leading types of opioids used. Not only that, but in this current cohort of people who are using opioids and who, for example, are using heroin or synthetics, the first drug that they start with is prescription opioids. So because of that, regulating access and appropriate use of prescription opioids is still a priority today. Because if we regulate it appropriately, then the hope is that we will prevent that whole cascade, right? That whole transition from prescription opioids to heroin and then to synthetics. And I think in that, the pharmaceutical industry has an important role to play. So we did a study where we used data released through the Sunshine Act. We have actually open access to data on the amount of money physicians are paid for any kind of interaction with the pharmaceutical industry. And we found that in places where physicians were paid more by the pharmaceutical industry, and this doesn't have to be like a $10,000 honorarium, it can be like a $5 meal. In fact, most of the payments are $5 meals. Those kinds of payments changed the physician's behavior. Those physicians who received payments from the pharmaceutical industry were more likely to prescribe opioids, and then we saw that overdose deaths in those areas were more likely to increase. So I think there's an exciting turn now by states to try to regulate the pharmaceutical industry. It's very recent, but there have been some efforts, for example, to regulate direct marketing to physicians, gifts to physicians, and I think those kinds of measures are very important if we are going to stop this pathway from prescription opioids to heroin to synthetics.
The two observations. One is, still not sure what you do against the illegal manufacturers. And the second observation on the $5 fund. I mean, I know enough about physicians' wages that $5 is not the decisive feature. So the question is, what's the source of the influence? Is it the money, or is it the fact that when you sit down to somebody, have a chance to tell them your side of the story, and the side of the story that you will tell will be the Bernick story from this morning, right? Rather than the other story that we heard from Novak and Rice. That is, they're saying these things really is a huge gap in the market. You ought to prescribe them because there are a lot of people dying of pain. So just on those two questions,
Yeah.
and then we'll go down.
Okay, so I'm going to answer the second one first. So you're right, $5 is not going to change a physician's salary in any substantial way, but what we think, we were very surprised by this finding, but what we think it is that it establishes a context of trust and communication with the pharmaceutical industry. These are low value but very frequent payments that the pharmaceutical industry is making to one provider, for example. And so this establishes just a line of communication and a belief and trust in the safety of the product. So we think that's what's going on rather than the actual value. We think the actual value doesn't matter so much as the relationship and the opportunity to interact with physicians. In terms of regulating the illegally manufactured supply, I don't know. I think that's a huge question. that I'm actually hoping that
The
my
lawyers will
colleagues
solve.
in law will be able to help me think through.
All right, well, Sheriff Epstein is not coming to the rescue, so now, Talib, you
Well,
have
I
anything to say?
don't know that I'm going to be that much.
You're a lawyer too, right?
I am a lawyer,
Guilty as charged.
But my viewpoint on it is, again, if we continue to focus on the supply side problem, then we are just taking away from the demand side problem. So while I do agree that there are some people who just become addicted because they take the drug once and then they become addicted, you have to understand that what is called the iatrogenic addiction rate for opioids is actually a lot less than the narrative would lead you to believe. As a matter of fact, when I started doing this research before everybody decided that drugs were cool again, and I was the lone addiction researcher, I looked at the Cochrane database. Does anybody know what the Cochrane database is?
No.
Okay,
Like
so
you
medical
tell us.
schools use the Cochrane, they do systematic reviews of, of uses of medications, of procedures, of how to, so they did a systematic review of opioids, and at the time, I promise you, it said that the iatrogenic addiction rate to opioids was so low that it was not a concern, because the studies that were conducted were not very, they weren't large enough sample sizes. You have to meet certain credibility to be included in this Cochrane database. Okay. Now, since then, they have removed that, and it now says vaguer language. But still, you'll notice that they're very hesitant about including a rate. But there was a recent study a couple years ago, I think it was in the New England Journal of Medicine, in which they did a systematic review of all the data that's out there. And I disagree. I think they were being a little bit nice about their inclusion of some of the studies, but even they said a conservative estimate, or an overly indulgent estimate, it's 5 to 8%. Okay, that's iatrogenic addiction. When you take it, you get addicted just from the properties of the drugs, all right, or your biological propensity to become addicted to the drug. So why else are the 95% of the other people are not addicted to the substance? Right, and what are about the other people who use to escape? So as far as what do we do about the illicit distributors, what we've been doing, we're pretty good at that. You know, I hate to say it, but we're probably the leaders in targeting drug cartels and illicit distributors. And sure, things have changed, things have gone on the internet, but I think we have enough there. I think the question is, how do we get people to stop feeling like they need to escape?
Okay, now I'm going to ask Sheriff Oliva the same question in slightly different fashion. What we heard was that when you're talking about a conversion rate, most people who get exposed to this stuff don't flip over and become chronically exposed to this stuff. And so the question then is, what does this tell us about what we ought to do? And most particularly, you mentioned something about the Controlled Substances Act, right, in your talk? And maybe you tell us a little bit there as to whether or not you think you could tweak that in order to handle the problem of how you go after illegal sources and what you do with legal sources. The legal source problem, I think, becomes more difficult if the conversion rates are lower, and the illegal stuff is the problem about diffuse enforcements against parties. So is there any way that you can sort of look at both sides of this particular problem?
Well, to the first point, my argument and why my proposed solution was what it was earlier is that whatever the rate of flipping is, if you allow a drug to be legal for a long period of time and for people to take it for chronic pain, regardless of whether they develop use disorder, they will develop a physical dependency to the drug, which are two dramatically
It's not
different
addiction.
things.
Yep.
So when someone has a physical
Are you a
dependency,
doctor too?
no, not at all. No. That's what I went to law school because I couldn't do math.
Well, okay, but you've got a good fakery going on there.
Well,
Keep going.
learn from
I'm
the best.
impressed.
And in some of those studies, I think that really scared people initially. There were people who don't really do addiction research, and they confuse physical dependence with actual substance use disorder, which are two different things.
Okay, keep going.
So I agree with what she said. I'm just going to say that people will become dependent. That's not that's not a DSM-5 problem. That's just a physical reaction to the drug. So the number one thing you don't want to do with a narcotics dependency is a fast taper or a patient abandonment, because immediately someone's going to get egregiously sick. We call it dope sick. There's a book written about this. Well, they could potentially even die from dehydration and other conditions. So my argument is that as far as the gap in the market, it is a reasonable response for someone in that kind of a health condition to make a substitute. And not to make a substitute because they are addicted to drugs, but because they want to feel better. And getting any kind of narcotic back in the system is going to assist.
Can I ask, what I think you're saying is as follows: you want more rather than less opiates available, but you want the new ones to come in to be sort of like vaccines that is attenuated. So instead of having to go from 1 to 0, you could stop at 7.5, 5.5, and 0.25. Are you willing to do that, or do you think lower dosages are permissible level, or do you want a whole new class of opiates coming into the markets which are strong enough to get you off, but not strong enough to get you addicted?
You're just stating the ideal situation.
I am? Great.
I'm going to go further than that because the situation that we inherited wasn't that good. It wasn't moderated the way that you're discussing. And I would have preferred for people to stay on prescription opioids that were regulated substances that have been screened rather than go out in the street to a poison drug supply. And that's one of the reasons why the overdose we saw downward trends on prescribing and upward trends on ODs, and that's because we went from a non-poison supply, even if folks were dependent, to a poison supply. So again, my argument is, instead of having a knee-jerk reaction and getting hysterical, we should have listened to public health people and had a public health intervention, which was a slow taper, a moderate approach, treating people who had this issue, which happened perfectly legally under everyone's nose, including the DEA's, instead of the DEA being able to be overreactive and create this substitution problem for people with dependency and not use disorder and force them outside the safe supply of narcotics in order to feel healthy.
Okay, so now let me ask another question. We're going to go to this mid-level situation.
Okay.
And the question is, how do you administer it? Do you allow people to take these things on the street, at which point you may double dosage to avoid it? Or do we actually want to have, as you do with some drugs, sort of government dispensaries so that you could get it, but you have to go to a place where it's administered to you rather than allowing you to get a supply, long-term supply, and administer it yourself? Do you actually have a view on the question of the distribution mechanism for the stuff that is coming in under the table?
Well, there's been other approaches in other countries that have proven successful. So
And what are they? Tell us.
Amsterdam, for example, went with the mid-level, what I'm talking about, sort of coffee house approach, right? So marijuana is actually technically illegal in Amsterdam, right? So what they decided to do, though, was target illegal distributors, the big guns, and you can now go into a coffee shop with something that's been screened, and literally the coffee shop twists the marijuana in Amsterdam into a legal substance at that point. But the coffee shop owners are buying the drugs illegally under Holland law. So they've created a whole system because
But the illegally but pure stuff.
but pure, it has to be tested before they can bring it in.
So
So
it's
they
funny,
have to follow.
it's a gray market.
It's a gray market, right? So they have to follow the rules. This ended up working, and the cultural narrative was, well, we would rather have our children do this in a supervised situation. It's been tested, it's been clean. Another example would be Switzerland, a very conservative country compared to Holland in the European Union, that decided to allow people to safely use heroin under supervision as heroin-assisted treatment, and to taper them off of that under physician supervision. This has actually lowered the rate of overdose dramatically in Switzerland, and it's a very interesting case study. The third case study, of the most famous one, is Portugal, which is a very complicated system where you have to go before a dissuasion panel and all sorts of other things, but drugs have been decriminalized there.
But there you have to basically make an administrative application
They
instead
do.
of getting it as a right.
Can I just make an observation maybe to create some more controversy?
That's okay.
So I just want
to
to.
get back to the end of the rhyme, but it's okay, but first, and then Patricia.
Just about the whole demand versus availability issue. I think it's not an either-or question here. Of course, not everybody who uses prescription opioids becomes addicted. Of course, it's people who have other risk factors, right? People who have history of anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, physical injury, economic problems, a whole host of things. But that's just like with any other drug, right? But it's a combination of both availability and individual vulnerability. So we know that even though a minority of people will become addictive, we also know it's a highly addictive substance, and we know that availability matters. The other thing that we really have to be careful with prescription opioids is that we know they're not effective to treat chronic pain. In fact, a year ago, an article was published suggesting that we stop using prescription opioids for chronic pain altogether, and we only use them in the case of acute injuries. So it's a really
There's disagreement, though, about whether or not that's
Yeah.
true.
Yeah, we're all going to.
Yeah, we're all gonna disagree.
Very bad.
One of the things that we do in this particular lawsuit, since we're socialists at the core, is we have a fairness doctrine. And so, no, but you're not going to get to just a free talk. The fairness doctrine requires that I give you a question, right?
Okay.
And so the question is, you started to talk about the FDA.
Yes.
And already what happens is on the illicit stuff, their approvals don't matter. And so what I want to know is exactly, the FDA also has a criminal side, an enforcement side, a capture side. And here's what I would want to do is, when you do the FDA, should it in effect be step up its enforcement action? Or should it, for example, with something like marijuana, medical marijuana? The Controlled Substances Act people have dominated the drug people thus far legally, right? So you're constantly working about the edges. Do you think, in effect, that the FDA should try to turn this from a criminal problem into a regulatory problem that we have to deal with? And if we do an effective job on the regulatory problem, will we reduce the size of the criminal sector?
The opioid problem. Not
Well, yeah, I
marijuana.
mean,
Yeah.
but the reason I mention marijuana is it's obviously not as deadly, right? But, there's a fierce resistance to it, and then you create all sorts of alternative institutions. People smuggle it in. It's part of the gray market, I think, today, and probably for a good thing. But I want to know, essentially, if we're talking about these tapered systems under controlled institutions, the FDA presumably has that kind of institutional capacity. What, if anything, ought it to do? Or should it simply decide to say that something can or cannot get on the market and wash its hands of the illegal supply?
So, I think with respect to the FDA, as the start of your question alluded to, the distinction between regulatory and enforcement is not clear. There are criminal violations of FDA statute can be prosecuted as crimes. And so often the power that comes with FDA regulation and the power of FDA to influence the public health is backed up by this very large stick that there are criminal prosecutions possible for violations of FDA statute. So it could be both. It could be that FDA does a better job enforcing at the borders. If something is illicitly manufactured fentanyl coming in from another country, it not only violates the Controlled Substances Act, distributing that in the United States also violates FDA statute. So, generally, if DEA has authority there, DEA probably would be the lead, but in circumstances where there's a substance that's not a controlled substance, not a listed substance under the Controlled Substances Act, FDA statute has been used to prosecute the distribution of those substances because typically they're also unapproved drugs, and distributing them violates federal law.
Can I have a question about that?
Yeah.
I would assume that it's easy enough to make the fentanyls and the synthetics that there would be no reason to try to run the extra hurdle of importation, that these things would be domestically produced and domestically distributed. And if so, who produces them? And is it an unorganized or an organized network of distribution?
That is a good question. I don't know that I can fully answer, but the FDA's authority would be the same so long as there's some piece of the product that moves in interstate commerce at some point. But I will, I guess, follow up on Magdalena's point, which is not part of your question, but I agree that, so one thing I think that it's fair to criticize FDA about is that there really isn't good data that opioids are effective for treating non-cancer chronic pain, and yet there are a bunch of opioids that are approved for that indication, and so we might wonder about why that happened. Typically, the studies that supported approval were about 12 weeks long, but patients use them much longer, and the indications don't necessarily include that limitation. That's not to say that we shouldn't treat chronic pain. As the panel this morning talked about, chronic pain and pain in general is in itself an important public health problem, but it's also tied into the way we pay for healthcare. Opioids are very inexpensive. Other kinds of treatments for non-cancer chronic pain are not necessarily inexpensive, maybe not covered by insurance, maybe also don't have great data supporting them. So this is an area where we need more evidence, we need more options for patients to treat this kind of pain. So an argument that maybe opioids don't do a great job here is not an argument that we shouldn't treat patients or that the pain is not real, just to be clear.
Patricia, you
Completely
raised a
agree.
question. Do you have a comment?
Oh, no, I was just
You
gonna
have one. I have a great question, but you can
Yeah,
answer.
no, I was just going to say that the paper that I wrote for this panel, for those of you who got a copy of it where it's on the website, is actually about just what he asked, Professor Epstein asked Patricia, which is, should we move some of the criminal enforcement back to the FDA from the DEA? Because I go over the political history. The FDA used to do what the DEA does back in the 50s and 60s. So if you're interested in
And I will say, even though FDA's has a criminal enforcement aspect, the mission of the agency is fundamentally different than the mission of the DEA.
Yep.
So FDA's mission is about protecting and promoting the public health. DEA's mission is about law enforcement. So even though there are criminal prosecutions, the mission and the reasons why the agency pursues them are different, and that might matter for outcomes.
I'm going to make one comment about the sort of the drug enforcement under the Controlled Substances Act. My favorite observation has to do again with medical marijuana, in which their attitude towards it, these patients who actually think they feel better by virtue of the fact that they've been treated with really don't understand the way their own minds work, and they're not better off, even though subjectively they think they're better off, which gives rise to all sorts of philosophical conundrums. And so the reason you don't want to have the Controlled Substances Act people in there is they simply regard pain as epiphenomenal in a sense which is rather different from the way in which you regard it as a serious psychological problem. So I agree with you. I think it's not only mission and so forth. I think the mindset is completely different on these things. But now I do have another question, and I'm going to, Magdalena, since I guess you are the doctor in the house, right? Are you a doctor?
Yes, I have a PhD.
Yeah,
Not a
doesn't-
medical doctor.
Oh, I'll ask you anyway. I will forgive. The question I wanted to ask is it's actually what it takes off of what Patricia said. She said there are different kinds of opioids. And I want to ask the following question. For this particular sort of study, are all opioids created equal? We've already mentioned the taper problem, which would require differentiation either in drugs or in dosage. But is it possible to have a strategy in which you pick out those opioids which you think have the best cost-benefit relationship for chronic pain and leave those to be used while eliminating the others? Or is this just a fool's errand trying to figure out whether you could do these kinds of differentiations?
That's a good question.
I keep getting that answer.
Well, you have good questions.
I feel like the abuse deterrent ones. What do you think about the abuse?
Right,
I don't know about this. I defer to you all, but abuse deterrent.
Yeah, so for example, avoiding extended release formulations. So if you are going to use prescription opioids, I would say using them for what is most medically indicated, like cancer pain or acute pain would be indicated, and not using them for chronic non-cancer pain. If you were to use prescription opioids in general, I would say avoiding certain formulations like extended release formulation, avoiding using them for long periods of time, avoiding using them at high dosages. Those kinds of things are important. Reformulations, so there have been some attempts at
Let me
reformulation.
push back a little bit on the extended release stuff and the alternative treatments. Generally, in many areas of medicine, multiple release single pills per day are regarded as a huge advance over having to take multiple stuff. Because what happens is if you have to take this thing every 4 hours, you're going to take it 7 times one day and 3 times the next day. Whereas if you have extended relief, you take it every morning with breakfast. So I'm not so sure that that actually counts as an advantage in this particular case, because I don't think you're taking into account the patient responses and the differential levels of confidence. Is that a fair objection to what you've just said or not? Good question.
I'm
I think in Magdalena's defense,
Defend it?
No. I do agree. So initially, if you look at kind of the write-ups from the FDA, when the extended release came out, the idea was that it would be less addictive theoretically because you don't get this sudden thrush of the drug and it tapers over time, and we know that that's not necessarily what happened. But I think that one of the big issues had to do with the marketing of the drug and whether or not it actually was, it covered the time span that it said it did. So I believe Purdue marketed that it covered X amount of hours, 12 hours, when it really didn't.
More or
And so-
less.
I'm sorry, less.
Less.
And so people were then having to, right, and that's
So it's
why
to
when we talk about the
multiply.
torts and should these pharmaceutical companies be held liable, I mean, there definitely were some torts there, and there's certain, you know, being held liable for knowing that your data wasn't exactly great, but marketing it'll be 12 hours, and then people running out at 8, and then wanting to take another
Right.
pill, but it's a 12-hour pill. What do you do, right? So I think that's why,
Yeah.
that's part of the.
That's a very traditional old line misrepresentation case. So
Yes.
you become a libertarian. Congratulations on that particular situation. But I still want to ask you, I don't know whom to go start with just down the road on this side. We heard that, well, you don't want to use opioids for non-cancer patients. For cancer patients, I'm not worried about conversion. Most of them are terminal cases, I assume, right? And if they live long enough to convert, that's a godsend rather than a problem, right? But what do we do, I'm going to put it to both of you,
problem.
with respect to those people who are non-cancer patients for whom we deny the use of opioids? What are the non-opioid substitutes that can deal with chronic pain?
Well, there aren't good non-opioid, but for chronic pain, but let me just also respond to this earlier conversation.
You may.
May I? Okay, thank you. One of the other problems with being such an absolutist about this, instead of looking at it from a nuanced perspective, is that we then created these like one-size-fits-all for patients that don't work, and again exacerbated the problem. So like you can't get more than a 3-day supply. Well, for example, everyone agrees that opioids are appropriate to prescribe to women who get hysterectomy. Hysterectomy is the #1 surgery that's performed in the United States on a daily basis. Okay.
It is?
Yes.
And I'm denied that privilege?
You are also denied that privilege. So you tell a rural woman who lives in a state like I used to in West Virginia that she has to come in every 3 days, who lives by herself, who's just had a hysterectomy, has to drive X, Y. That's a terrible, terrible policy. It's that woman is going to be in incredible pain. No one disagrees with this scenario, but they fall then under this like hysterical, reactive regulatory scheme that's put in place when we don't look at this as a nuanced, complex problem.
Yeah, just as a way of comment, it turns out rural medicine presents such incredibly difficult problems that all city slickers tend to annoy them. I once had to lecture on this in Kansas, and I talked about the general problems, and afterwards my host went up and says, what do you do with the farmer who gets an industry and he's 80 miles from the nearest office, and when he gets to the nearest office, he's only going to see a GP? And you start talking about telemetry and everything else. So I think, in effect, what you're really saying is that access cannot be pursued to be a Dwayne Reed around the corner, and that for certain people, you ought to have larger supplies that you can start to give. Or can you have FedEx packages that can be delivered to them?
No, because the rule was that you had to come back and see the provider so they could check on you to make sure
Oh,
you know you
okay.
weren't going down the rabbit hole of drug addiction at day
Now,
4.
again, I'm going to ask you, what about the telemedicine, Ms. Joy? Can the doctors see you, put you on a screen and talk to you, or do they actually have to be able to touch you?
That's a good question, and telemedicine is regulated at the state level, so that depends on jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And I also just want to mention, I did use the rural example because it hits home, but there are plenty of urban women who could be in a very similar situation that have childcare issues, that need the drug so they can go back to work right away because they need to for economic reasons, that could be put in a very, very similar bind. And this can be a huge problem. I just wanted to mention that there are numerous situations where these one-size-fit-all, knee-jerk situations, especially in the acute care treatment situation, that have really exacerbated problems for people and put them in unnecessary, egregious pain.
I now got two libertarians.
Can I respond to that?
Only if you're a libertarian. No, go right ahead.
I agree, and I think that overall there is an issue of in a way of an overreaction. If before physicians were being penalized for not prescribing opioids, now they're afraid to prescribe opioids in any case, and in fact in some cases even refuse when it is medically indicated. So that is definitely an issue. But we also have to think about whether using opioids more than 3 days is what is most indicated, or whether there are other solutions, like for example a short course of opioids and then substituted for something else like NSAIDs. So I think, and also, as was brought up before, thinking about other alternatives, right? Of course, pain is a huge issue, but we need to figure out what actually works, right? And what are the most effective ways to treat pain and in a way that doesn't harm people. So I think there needs to be, at the same time that we focus on regulating opioids, we really need to do a lot of research on that to make sure that people get the treatment that they need in an effective way.
Now, Columbus, Ohio, I believe, is not a hick town.
I guess not, no.
And so, look,
Maybe relative to New York it is,
well,
but,
no,
yeah.
not to New York. New York is in a class beyond itself. But anyhow, I still haven't had an answer to my question. Maybe you could help me with if in fact we're getting people and we're weaning them off of opioids for non-cancer type treatment, what are the reliable substitutes? And not only that, once they're reliable, of course, they're going to have side effects too. And so the question is this an improvement, or as we used to say, jumping from the frying pan into the fire?
So I think that is one important public health problem right now, that there isn't good, solid data about what other substitutes are available. One way to conceive of how we deal with that problem, that maybe isn't good data that opioids are particularly good for long-term chronic non-cancer pain, but there also isn't sort of an obvious other thing to do, is to expect providers to have that conversation with their patients about what the data are, or supporting opioids, what the risks of starting opioids are. Opioids might not ultimately make your pain feel better, but it is something you can do. Maybe there are other things you can try, physical therapy, depending on the condition. Some patients, of course, use cannabis now, I think also for chronic pain conditions. There's not good data for that necessarily either. But I think it's a question of risks and benefits in a public health question for which we don't have a good answer right now.
Now, I have another question. I'm going to ask it to the panel. This is something which has always bothered me. Every time I go on a panel with people more learned than myself, I'm always told that it is an empirical question which is in need of further investigation and research. But on the other hand, now put yourself in the position of a prescribing physician or a patient. When the research is not done, what is your recommended, I'll ask it to all four of you, decision procedure when there is no empirical evidence of a strong variety? How, under these circumstances, do you wish to handle that particular kind of question? Any volunteers?
I actually was going to push back on what you all were saying about there is not much evidence. There is evidence, it's just not the type of evidence that so patients use them and they want them and they say it makes them feel better, right? And there are studies that are not clinical trials, that don't necessarily have control groups, in which they do seem to help. So we're taking away something that patients seem to think helps them. Even if they're not addicted, maybe have a physical dependence, they don't have a propensity to addiction. So we use the word evidence, but let's just be specific. It's a specific kind of evidence that we're looking
This
at.
I think is a very important question. I'm going to push it. For example, with Duchenne's multiple dystrophy, all the professionals said you don't have sufficient evidence. All the mothers said either you let my kid do this or they're going to die. And so the point here is, look at the FDA. I'm looking right at you, Patricia. There you are.
Yeah.
What happens is, the question is, should the FDA and other organizations take into account this kind of anecdotal evidence, or should they only content themselves with looking at systematic double-blind studies and so forth? And how does that work, Magdalena, when we start to think about this in the opioid question? What do we do if we don't have this stuff, and how long is it going to take us if, in fact, we use protocols which are much more time-consuming than, well, this works on my Johnny, so let my Susie take it too?
Yeah, I think when you're talking about something like controlled substances, using clinical trials is the gold standard, and it should be a priority because we know that anecdotal evidence is biased in many ways, and there might be many reasons why people say they feel better that don't have anything to do with the drug. And it seems to me that, especially with controlled substances which carry a lot of risks, we really need to apply the best evidence possible before we make decisions on authorizing them and figuring out how to regulate them.
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental problem for FDA right now, how to weigh different kinds of evidence. And in recent federal laws in the 21st Century Cures Act that was enacted in 2016 amended FDA statute to permit it to consider what's called real-world evidence instead of clinical trials in approving new indications for already approved drugs, and also included provisions to encourage the agency to incorporate patient experience data into its assessment. So there's a big push at the agency right now to figure out how to incorporate these kinds of patient experiences into its evaluation of products. If we think historically, part of one argument or one theory for why we have the FDA is, unfortunately, with things like drugs, the market's actually not very good at giving us signals about what works and what doesn't. The dietary supplement industry is a great example of that today. It's a $40 billion industry that
Works really well.
right. So it works really well for some members of society. By and large, for most dietary supplements, there's very little evidence supporting that they do anything. Now, we might be less worried about that because there's also far fewer risks, generally, not always, associated with dietary supplements. But, I think it's important to figure out the right way to give patients a voice. It's important to listen to what patients are saying, but it's also important, especially when we're talking about products that have significant risks, to have good evidence supporting the claims that are made about what they can do for patients.
I know, but this is again the question, what do I do today as opposed to what
I
do we
got
want?
an answer to that.
Okay, well, she's going to give an answer, then I will give a comment. So.
Jen, can you also just talk a little bit about why clinical trials are not representative of the patient population that uses the drugs? Because I see some rolling eyes when I say clinical trials, and everybody's like, oh, gold standard. Right, how they select people for clinical trials, right?
But a question about who should be included in clinical trials and whether we need clinical trial data are two separate questions, right? Anyway.
Yes.
I agree with all that, but I do also agree that, they're very skewed and problematic, and that's why Patty's suggestion in her article about expanding out is just smart. I mean, why not?
What was this? What's so smart? I missed it.
Patty wrote a
Taking
great
a public
article,
health
yeah.
approach and
Oh, okay.
interpreting the FDA statute
Okay.
as permitting the FDA to sort of look at some
Yeah.
of this other
Amen. Yeah,
evidence.
long overdue.
Long overdue.
Now, I have the following question. Well, first of all, two things. One is I will take questions from the audience in 1 second, and I know who's going to ask the first one. But what I wanted to say, this is essentially the same epistemic problem that we have with respect to off-label uses, in some sense. And it is very clear that if, in fact, conditional upon the drug being approved for one use, which means you negate instant death and similar things like that, off-label uses in many areas completely dominate on-label uses. And the question is, if you're really this kind of empiricist, you would think that this would be a mistake. And so if there is a situation here in which there's some industry-wide practice that gets adopted with respect to opioids that doesn't meet your clinical standards, would you follow that on the off-label usage method, or would you want to switch to something else and reject that? That's the question to the panel. I love the answer. Go ahead, Patricia.
So I think you're absolutely right that it's an analogous problem to off-label use, and probably would, in fact, if opioids were not approved for non-cancer chronic pain, it would just simply be an off-label use problem because there aren't restrictions for the most part on prescribing for uses that FDA has not approved. There are ways that off-label uses can be controlled. FDA has the authority to require certain kinds of risk mitigation programs for drugs through which it can limit the ways drugs are used in practice. But there's also, I think, we're talking a lot about FDA and DEA. There's also other regulators that might play a role. State medical boards might play a role in policing appropriate medical care. They don't often do a whole lot in that space. And tort law, I suppose, might play a role as well, but I'll let others weigh
No,
in too.
I mean, the problem about tort law is that you can't sue
Yeah.
anybody for the treatment which has never been used that should be used. And that is a non-trivial problem. Yes, Jennifer?
I do think she makes a really good point about state regulators, boards of medical practice. The regulation of medicine is not done at the federal level, and when that's a whole thing in marijuana, and we've had all sorts of drama. And let me just say, doctors are in a bind. So I was actually going to really directly answer your question to say that my legal advice to a physician without an alternative treatment to someone who is in pain would be to treat that pain patient the best way that you can, including with opioids, and taper them down. And let me just say that this is not my personal opinion. The New Hampshire Board of Medicine recently suspended a doctor's license for just abandoning his chronic pain patients and refusing to prescribe them opioids. And his argument was, I'm not allowed to do this. Look at all these crazy rules coming at me. And by the way, I don't want to lose my livelihood and be prosecuted by the DEA. And he's now been punished at the state level for patient management and violating the local standard of care, which is not to just cut patients off and abandon them. So doctors are sort of, not to be a huge doctor advocate here, but they have been squeezed in from both sides of the state.
By the way, the general rule for those of you who are curious is that under most states, if you do not follow a recommended practice through off-label uses, you are guilty of medical malpractice, even if the legal standard is the other way. This is simply the institutionalization of a gray market. And as somebody, there are two forms of evidence. There's the French model that everything has a deductive solution. There's an English model, if the bridge doesn't fall down, then you built it correctly. And they're trying to figure out which of these two models work. I tend to be in areas of radical uncertainty, more on the English than on the French model. And the reason is that you can put this one to use immediately, and then if the formal information comes, you can change it later. The rate of change in custom is a function of the infusion of major new evidence, in my experience, having talked to these people, is extremely rapid because the medical profession is now organized to essentially have conferences, bulletins, and so forth, which flip things over within a matter of hours, days, and so forth. And so I don't think there's a danger of over-permanence with respect to the sort of the ad hoc model. Now, I have lots more questions to ask, but I think that somebody in the audience may have a question. So if there's some intrepid soul who would like to ask a question, Luis, you may. But is there somebody who could give her a microphone somewhere? Ladies, why don't you take one? We have an extra one here. All right, you give me the microphone. And Louisa, I know who you are,
Yes.
but nobody else does, so please. Stand up. Come on.
Yes, all right. Louise Papke, I'm a fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at the moment. Just a brief question on the sort of trials. So you said, and I read the same thing about the widespread use of antidepressants. So we basically seem to have only evidence of like 12-week, if I understood correctly, trials on these drugs, and then so now there's a long-term use for it. And I was just wondering why that is, in the sense like, well, if we now see a long-term use for these drugs, why don't we have trials that go longer, leaving alone the representativeness of trial participants, et cetera? Just, is there a rule coming from outside? I don't really see why sort of now there wouldn't be any longer trials.
Trial and error. Is there a short answer here?
Well, yeah, it has to do with the FDA approval process. I mean, Patty wants to talk about it a little bit.
Oh,
Whether you want to or not.
Yeah, whether you want to or not, you were now.
I'm happy to. So one reason why trials are short in general, not just for opioids, is sort of the reality that, there's a balance between generating evidence about long-term use of a product and the reality that regulators need to make decisions, and we want the process to go on, right? We want a drug to come up for approval and FDA to actually make a decision. So if we say we need to study a drug for 10 years before it's approved, we all don't, that drug isn't approved for 10 extra years, and there's a delay in the approval and the drug getting to the market. So there's a balancing between wanting the evidence and approval. Once a drug's already approved, like the opioids are, there's much less of a financial incentive for industry to study the drug. They no longer need that research in order to get FDA approval because physicians can often prescribe, generally can prescribe off-label. There's no, the drug can be used in ways for which it's not approved once it has one approval. So there isn't always a financial incentive to study those additional uses or put the money in to do the long-term trial of opioids. the FDA can never, for like public health reasons, go back on?
No, they can.
They can,
Since
yes.
what, 2007, they specifically can ask for, Patty may argue and others may argue that they have had this power for longer, but it has been made official through legislation that the FDA does have the power to do what's called post-market surveillance, and now specifically requests that additional studies are done. And I was reviewing some last night when I was preparing. Some of them are for long-term use. One of them they asked for, the other I was looking at was like 12 months. But there's problems with this process as applied, so.
Yes,
Yeah.
the other thing on this, just a technical answer, is once the drug is publicly approved, there are private agencies that do long-term linear studies, and they don't only do it with respect to people who are covered by the FDA, but they do it with respect to foreign uses of these drugs, off-label uses, and so forth. So it's not clear how valuable that information is given these alternative sources of supply, which are privately generated. There's another comment?
Are they made publicly available?
Almost always. What happens is in two forms. There's on these particular sites, like the cancer site, what you do is you have a technical side, which is open to doctors, and then you have a public side, slightly watered down. The theory is on the public side, you want people to know enough to ask a physician who knows something more so as to be able to do this. And this is used with respect to off-label drugs, which the public indices, by the way, just to make this clear, one of the things that nobody's talked about here, but it obviously comes in the connection here, is there are many kinds of treatments for which compound drugs are in fact the optimal sort of solution. So you want to give somebody a drug to cure a cancer, but they're going to create an ulcer. What you do is you put two things together and you give the treatment drug and the mediation drug at the same time. The FDA actually often requires that you prove the combination to be safe and effective, even if you prove the two individual parts to be safe and effective, which I regard as straight out of the loony bin, but nonetheless that turns out to be the kind of dominant rule. But one of the things that the FDA doesn't do by virtue of the structure of its approval process is it doesn't give you compound strategies that you could follow for the treatment of opioid. So it may well be you want to do 3 months of this or 2 weeks of this and then something of the other. There is nothing in that approval process to do it. The physician guides, in fact, do talk about drug interactions, preferred, less preferred drugs, and compound sorts of procedures. So the private information actually is better directed because it's directed holistically, whereas the FDA procedure turns out to be directed to product specific. Did you not know that, Doc?
No, I did not. That's interesting because, I mean, in epidemiology, we talk about these drug interactions like between opioids and benzodiazepines, opioids and alcohol.
Yeah.
But I didn't.
The manufacturers love this process, as you know, Dr. Epstein.
Doctor, don't do
Because they
that,
can
call me
put it
doctor.
on patent. There doesn't have to be that much difference in the drug, and any little extra added gives them like extravagant patent protection, even though they come in and use the other two independent drugs trials. But that's happened on numerous occasions.
Now, let me sort of give what I think is the right answer to that question. There are two things that you have to do. There's one called patenting an improvement over an existing drug. And so long as the existing drug is on the market, the new drug can only charge a price which reflects the increment of its improvement. And one wants to give you an incentive so that they will precisely do that. There are cases, and this is a different problem, but it's not a patent problem. It's the Orange Book problem, which is very different, which is you have a drug which is on the market. The company makes an improvement of the drug. They then take the original drug off the market, and since it's no longer a reference drug, you cannot use generics against it. The correct answer to that is not to fix the patent system, which is fine. It's to make sure that once something is on the book as a reference drug for the Orange Book, you can't take it off even if you put a new drug on. So I think it's really important that you sort of understand what the mechanism turns out to be. The patent system actually gets the right sort of marginal incentives on this thing, but the Orange Book gets it wrong. Then you also get some antitrust kinds of applications, unilateral conduct, because when you move the one drug from the market, you're creating a monopoly for the second one. And what is that area that you've been testifying in?
Antitrust.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, or I'm going to have to ask another question? Yes, please come forward. Give this. We don't want a brass ring or a Cupid doll, but a microphone will do just fine.
Hi, my name's Barbara Newsom. I work at the Clinical Law Center at NYU. My question is, how do we inform the public more so that they are aware of the dangers of these drugs and that there may be opportunity for them to use other drugs or things in its place. I mean, there could be signage in hospitals. We can have these kind of discussions, which is great, but how do you reach the people that it really affects? Thank you.
Somebody? Go ahead.
I mean, that's a great question. One, I don't know how effective it's been, but in the antibiotic and antimicrobial space, you'll see posters in physicians' offices saying, most common colds are caused by viruses, you don't need antibiotics, with the goal of getting patients to ask for antibiotics less often so that we don't inappropriately contribute to the problem of antibiotic resistance. So, maybe we could have educational campaigns like that. I'm not an empiricist, so I don't know how effective those educational campaigns have been.
Don't do drugs campaigns usually don't work. We have a history in this country of education campaigns as far as you may be aware of DARE and so forth. I think where the education is important, and you've seen localities start to do this, is to educate what are called opioid naive patients or people who may have adverse events to opioids. I think that's the population that would be best suited from the education. And what I mean by that is to tell patients, for example, who might be on benzodiazepines and
Which are anti-anxiety
You can even
medications.
pronounce it, so you're a
Yeah.
genius.
which are anti-anxiety medications, and particularly the elderly population, and that take benzodiazepines and then also take opioids, can fall downstairs. There's a bunch of different adverse events that result, or drink some alcohol and cause an overdose. So those types of adverse events, I think, are best suited. But unfortunately, given our system of healthcare, I mean, people get medications from different doctors. There is no continuity of care. I know. There those socialists go again. But you're going to see where I'm going with
No,
this.
it turns out, by the way, I think this is a serious point, which is generalized campaigns are suffered by over-exhaustion. People see so many things that they don't pay attention to any of them. What you have to do in this business is once somebody's in the system with respect to one drug, that's the focal point at which you may be able to exercise them as the other. And it's not only the patient. Certainly with teenage kids who've got serious problems using opioids, you've got to get the family involved in one way or another. Generally speaking, I think it is widely understood that informed consent, if its focus is only on the patient, is a highly imperfect remedy. You really have to think of this as a social work, family disclosure, interactive kind of problem, because virtually everybody who's on these things needs somebody to prop them up when something starts to go bad. And this is not a case where, no man is an island, each man is a part of the continent, a piece of the main is part of what you have to do in this stuff. But it can only be done through voluntary groups. But I think the general public service announcements may work on cigarettes, although it really doesn't. I'm not aware of any one of these campaigns. Yes?
Can I just, if I could answer after.
You should. No problem, done.
So I agree that in terms of public education campaigns, like, don't use drugs, there's no evidence that they work. I will say that so there's two things. One, education about the safety of the drugs. I think their physician education in particular should play a big role. So having, for example, medical boards require continuing medical education on opioids in order to, adjoining licensing requirements is very important, because then if physicians are adequately trained on the use and prescribing of opioids, then they will be able to communicate the risk to the patient probably the most effective way. I do think at the same time there's a role for public education in other things. In particular, for example, the health department in New York City has played a big role in increasing public education about naloxone, about the role that naloxone can play in reversing overdoses, about treatment, about where you can access treatment, why accessing treatment is important. So I think public education campaigns about making people aware of resources and where they can go to get those resources are very important.
I will add that FDA's risk mitigation program for immediate release and long-acting opioids requires continuing medical education for prescribing, but I think it's critical that education for healthcare providers be education that's shown to be effective. So there are good data that things like what's called academic detailing. So this morning's panel talked about how pharmaceutical companies have representatives, advertising representatives that go to physicians and other healthcare providers and do what's known as detailing, in-person advertising. So that's actually really effective in communicating information to providers. And so if you have academic detailing from someone without a financial interest in the product about the risks and benefits of the product, that can be effective. That's not currently what FDA requires.
There is an
but-
important implication of this, which is the traditional model of information transmission used a duty to warn case imposed upon a product seller. And given everything that has been said here, it seems extremely important that you separate the information function from the delivery function so that third-party voices can come in. And so you have a mandated warning, which I think you have to comply with. The real issue in this area, which I have very strong views on, is the question as to whether or not a court, after the fact, when the FDA has given a warning, declare the warning essentially insufficient or inadequate, presume causation from the lack of information, and then have all these companies subject to suit. You cannot run a system like that. I think with ex post suits, given the fact that the alternative sources of information that allow individuation from the generic warning are also there. So that's my view about that, is we really do want to shut down some of the liability issues if it turns out we think that the FDA institutional process is working. And the FDA does have problems here. Often their warnings, as we noted, are too stiff rather than stiff enough. And so the liability side, I think, should really be very important. Yes?
I think that the one thing that is missed here is outside the FDA. I agree with you on the torts.
Woo!
The torts, because it's not effective, is that, again, I mentioned this at the beginning, and I'm just going to say it one more time because very few people listen. DEA, to get a DEA, a controlled substance registration number, can put all sorts of requirements on providers, okay? And they do when they provide medicated assisted treatment, opioid drugs, okay? When they, do Boof, Suboxone, you have to go through an 8-hour CE, you have to get a special waiver on your DEA registrant number.
And MAT treatment is,
What?
for those who don't know, what's MAT?
Medicated assisted treatment, so it's opioid agonist treatment. It's an opioid that actually effectively makes sure that you cannot get high, but then you don't suffer the dope sickness at the same time. So it's a sort of a different way to sort of taper people off a straight opioid. But for those drugs, you have to go to special training. Doctors don't want to do it. They have to get a special requirement. They have to do CEs. But you don't, to today, and you saw the DEA's position here, DEA has never required that for Schedule II opioids, like OxyContin.
Right.
They could do that today. They could have done that 5 years ago. They don't do it.
So they
And
make
what
it
would
hard
it
to teach,
achieve?
to treat the patients, basically. They make it difficult to treat the patients, basically, with medication-assisted treatment.
And way easier to actually just prescribe opioids without, the doctor made the point earlier, without that physician training, which is proved to be helpful.
Yeah, from a regulatory perspective, that to me seems crazy. The whole idea of the need for these X waivers, that doctors need to be trained a number of hours before they can prescribe buprenorphine, whereas that doesn't seem to be the case for other drugs, especially for opioids, seems completely
I
crazy.
mean, you
That's
want
what happens
more
when you-
training or less training? I don't
Well, that's what
quite.
happens when you have a criminal justice
No, that there
agency
should be no
in charge.
such requirement. There should be removal of that waiver requirement.
My God, I got 3 libertarians on the panel. Can I count for a fourth and I'll have a full house, right?
All right, well, let's talk a little
On
bit.
that, I agree, yes.
Yeah.
All right.
And we can also...
NYU is now moving into the modern age.
We can also talk about changing physician incentives if you want to turn this a little bit even more libertarian. We're paying fee for service, and we're not incentivizing physicians to have that conversation because they don't get paid to have that conversation with the patient, right? So if we hold physicians accountable in some way by maybe paying them quality bonuses for not having patients that are prescribed opioids fall down the stairs and end up in the hospital, then that's another way to...
I have another question to ask. If there's no other question in the audience, we're going to end this thing around 3 o'clock. So speak now or forever hold your peace, I think is what's going to happen. But one of the things that I've not heard mentioned here, I've got 2 questions actually, but I'll ask the first one, which is a narrow one, which is what is the role of second opinions on areas like this? Opioids seem to be a life and death kind of issue, right? And with other people go to several physicians about even cataract surgery and so forth. So, well, why not this? Is there a way that makes sense? Is there a way to do it? Is it something that's a trap or a delusion? Somebody please help me. Which of the physicians on this panel? Oh, I can't ask that question. Anyway, which of you can answer that or give a sense about it? You have one, Magda?
That seems very difficult and on.
They call you a drug seeker if you do
Yeah.
that, actually.
Oh, gee, that's wonderful.
Yeah, you
The
actually.
PDMPs will
Yeah.
actually say if you go to get a second opinion, that will raise a red flag.
That you
And
are a
your
drug
score will
seeker.
go up as a drug seeker if you seek multiple doctors'
Now, I mean,
opinions.
is it true if the first guy says, please take this drug, and you say, I'm not sure I need it, and you want to go to a second doctor, we're going to treat you as a drug seeker when you're trying to minimize
I think-
exposure?
no,
Time out,
no,
go ahead.
Yes,
So the-
yes.
So the BDMP will track
The
if
who
you've
what?
gotten opioids from multiple people, but not if you've consulted them and not gotten a prescription.
The NARC score, the APRIS NARC score also counts how many doctor visits you did in a particular time period.
Okay, now may I make one
Regardless of the
suggestion?
prescription
Church, on just the admission, this has been a problem which is raised with respect to Medicaid and Medicare generally. We do not have a comprehensive index by patient as to all drugs prescribed regardless of physician. All right, so if I go to 20 different doctors, it may be on 20 different doctors' scorecards, but there's not one on mine. Is there any way in which you could actually integrate the system so that you know what patients have gotten what treatment regardless of which physician has supplied it?
Have a universal health care. No, I'm just.
No,
Have
no,
a
no.
government-sponsored health care
No, no,
system.
no, I wanna-
Is that
that's
not the
the-
answer?
No,
We
no,
do
no.
have that. So prescription drug monitoring systems, that's what Jen's specialty is in. You want to talk about the extent to which prescription drug monitoring
Yeah.
systems do that?
Yeah, if you've been prescribed any scheduled controlled substance, every single state, Missouri just sort of came out of the dark ages really recently with an executive order before their governor resigned in 2018, has a prescription drug monitoring program. And what that program does is at the point of dispensing, so your retail pharmacist, et cetera, has to put a bunch of information in a state database that's usually held by one of the state health boards or the state board of pharmacy or sometimes the attorney general's office. They track all the drugs you've been prescribed. In fact, one of the most entertaining things I tell people who say, oh, I couldn't possibly be in there, is people don't know that all schedules, you probably are in there, including if you've gotten some kinds of contraception, et cetera. But if you've also had a dog spayed or neutered in the last 5 to 10 years in the United States, you are highly likely to be in the PDMP because they
I had a
prescribed that
with
dog an
cancer,
opioid.
And she was on
Oh,
tramadol. There you
so the
go.
veterinarian problem is something else
Yes.
that we,
Oh, no, that is actually,
I'm not
saying,
making a
yeah.
joke.
No, I'm not either.
One of the state's PDMPs, instead of putting the red flag by the people after they complained about this, put a paw.
okay, look, I want to make the following, I'm not gonna give a 1-minute question for which I will not tolerate an answer, but which I think is instructive. Somebody made the wisecrack, that's what we need universal health care for, right? And so I want to make the other wisecrack about this. And the answer is, if in fact you are concerned about patients' abilities to get jobs and so forth, right? I would like to just simply say that the Obama administration was terrible on job formation. The Trump administration, which you all love and admire, has been actually quite good on job formation in the most vulnerable populations in terms of labor participation and wage increases. I do not attribute it to our current president's wisdom, but I do think, in effect, that before you start thinking about nationalize this and nationalize that, deregulation to get greater access to labor markets by fringe players may be a preferred solution. You are now given 2 seconds by 4 libertarians to say yay or nay to this question before we adjourn, knowing that next year when we come back and deal with a similar problem, this will be etched into everybody's mind.
Nay.
I don't even know, what was the question?
I'm not an expert on labor markets, so, you know.
Neither am I.
Yeah.
Well, I am! No, I don't know whether I am. As I said, my basic provision in this world is jack of all trades, master of none. But one of the things I'd like to do is to thank our panelists who are fearless, intrepid, and informative. And in fact, they did not interrupt each other, and more importantly, they did not interrupt me. So let's all give them a wonderful round of applause.